Greetings all, Ferrari-Man 601 here. Welcome back to another 1/18th scale model car review of this rendered in 1/18th scale by Mini Champs, the Prost AP04. What are we doing taking a look at a midfield backmarker car? Well, just really a little bit of a change of pace here. We are used to looking at and thinking about and appreciating Formula One cars when they win, or when they're legendary for some respect, whether it's because of a driver or it's because of a team or because of some crazy happenstance that happened to mark the car's career. That's why we remember a given team or a given car in a given year. However, we do not often remember the also-rans. We do not often remember the gap fillers, the guys running at the back, the guys filling out the background in the shots of guys like Michael Schumacher and Mika Hakkinen and Lewis Hamilton crossing the line to win a Grand Prix. However, this is one of those cars that was a gap filler, that filled in the backdrop in many an iconic photograph in the 2001 season, the Prost AP04. It is not a championship winner. It's not a race winner. In fact, it's not even a podium finisher. It only scored a handful of points in its entire career, and only one of the 5 drivers who drove it in anger even scored points in it. There's nothing remarkable at all about it, but it is something that I greatly appreciate, and I hope that I can show you why I greatly appreciate it. Because it is a little bit different, but also because it is a very cogently and logically thought out race car. It's stereotypical early 2000s. It's stereotypical V10. I love a V10. I love this era of Formula One, and therefore, when I saw this one come available here, I had to gobble it up because it's just a very pretty race car. And, well, I also happen to be a big fan of its eponymous team owner, Alain Prost, the 4-time Formula One World Drivers' Champion. So there it is, a match made in heaven as far as I'm concerned, in adding this one to the model collection. But what have we here? What was going on? Why is this car also interesting legitimately from a technical standpoint? And what relationship does it have with the reigning constructors champion of the time? Let's take a closer look at the Prost AP04 in 1/18th scale.
The Prost AP04. Why are we talking about this car? Well, quite honestly, I like it. It's just a little bit different to look at a car that was not near the sharp end of the grid most of the time, and just look at some of the things that might distinguish it somewhat from its running mates in the season in which it competed. In this case, 2001. We've taken a look at several 2000 through 2002 era cars, so we have our eyes pretty well attuned to what to expect to the cars of this era, particularly the front runners. We have looked at McLarens, Ferraris. We've looked at cars that have been winning races in this era, and here's a car that has not won any races. In fact, it has not taken any podium positions. Its best finish all year was 5th, courtesy of Jean Alesi in Canada. Otherwise, the car barely had any points scoring occasions. It scored just 4 points in the World Constructors' Championship. That was good for 9th overall at the end of the season. So we're looking at something that is not near the sharp end of the grid by any means, but we're still looking at a Formula One car. So it's still pretty cool. And it's a car that was owned by one of the greatest Formula One drivers of all time. Well removed from his driving career, of course. In 2001, he was at the end of his team ownership career as well. But Alain Prost, associated with this car, Prost, a 4-time world champion, one of the greatest Formula One drivers ever by any measure, so it's cool nonetheless. Also, we've got Jean Alesi in this one, and who doesn't love Jean Alesi? Anyway, the AP04, what is it? It's the car that was designed and built by Prost Grand Prix for the purpose of competing in the 2001 Formula One World Championship. As we mentioned, 2001 was the final year for Prost as a constructor. They were running into financial difficulties, quite unfortunately, which meant that they no longer were going to have the finances to run a Formula One team much less keep two cars running in a Formula One team. So 2001 was curtain call, unfortunately, for Prost Grand Prix and for ultimately the Formula One career of Alain Prost. Of course, his career as a driver had ended in 1993 when he won his fourth and final world championship, but he decided to come back as a constructor, and that's pretty interesting and pretty brave. Not too many Formula One drivers, particularly superstars on the caliber of Alain Prost, would decide to come back into the sport in a completely different role and then put their reputations on the line. Unfortunately for Prost, well, his reputation certainly preceded him. He didn't make good on that as a constructor, but he did it, and that is always something admirable in my book. However, the AP04, the last car fielded in Formula One by Prost Grand Prix, what is it? We have a design effort that was led by Henri Durand. He was assisted by Jean-Paul Gousset and Loïc Bichois. We have a very familiar name there in Loïc Bichois because he is currently the head of aerodynamics for Ferrari. So yes, we have got some interesting brain trust involved with the design of this car. The Ferrari connection, though, does not stop with Bichois. Of course, that is an anachronistic connection at this point. But this car really, when you get under the skin, is very much associated with Ferrari. It's actually very much associated with the Ferrari F1 2000. Yes, the 2000 Ferrari Formula One car. Bits and pieces of that, in a big way, are featuring here on the AP04. What do I mean? Well, what we've got here is a carbon fiber monocoque chassis, as you would expect from a Formula One car of this era. We've got the cockpit, we have the survival cell that envelops the driver in a swaddling cloak of carbon, yes, in order to keep him safe in the event of high-speed accidents. However, that carbon monocoque also providing the mounting points for our nose cone and front wing, as well as our fuel tank, and thereby our engine and gearbox and rear axle. So the structural core of the car in carbon, as you would expect, up and down the grid in this era. What we have in terms of suspension, front and rear, we've got double wishbone push rod done in a mix of steel and carbon. You see the push rods going up there at 45 degrees into the front of the monocoque, and of course they are going in to actuate inboard mounted dampers, torsion bars actually, particularly on the front end, but pretty conventional so far, as you would expect here for a 2000-2001 era Formula One car. The engine in this car, it is a 3-liter naturally aspirated V10 at 90 degrees. Now, alright, you'd expect that as well, but which manufacturer was it? Acer, the computer company, right? Well, in name only. The engine in the back of this car is actually the Ferrari Type 049. If that sounds at all familiar to you, well, that is the same specification of V10 that powered the Ferrari F1 2000. So yes, we have a hand-me-down Ferrari engine in the back of this car, the engine that won the Constructors' Championship in the year 2000. So nothing at all to sneeze at for this midfield car. Hooked up to that Ferrari engine is a Ferrari drivetrain. We've got a Ferrari 7-speed plus reverse sequential semi-automatic paddle shift box bolted to the back of that engine, sending power out through a Ferrari designed differential to the half shafts at the rear axle. So this car, from engine all the way out to rear axle, has Ferrari year 2000 Constructors' Championship winning running gear. That's pretty cool, all things considered, and especially considering that the formula didn't really change very much from 2000 into 2001. That's actually a little bit risky on the part of Ferrari as well, because obviously all of that technology is still fully applicable to the 2001 regulations as well, minus the advent of legal traction control. But otherwise, you've got a world championship winning car underneath that blue paint, so that's pretty interesting. Basically, everything a rears of the snorkel, Ferrari built that. Pretty cool, all things considered. Of course, when you look at the car in total, it's designed by Prost, it's manufactured by Prost, and all of the Ferrari components, they sent specs to Prost, and then they fit everything in, much like happens today with supply deals. For example, a team like Williams running Mercedes engines. Mercedes would have put together all the running gear and all of that associated equipment for Williams, but Williams are following the spec sheet from Mercedes. Same thing here. It's not like this car was built in Maranello and then sent over to Alain Prost, hey, go race this thing. So same customer deal in terms of the engine and driveline supplies that you would see today. Also accounts for the difference in performance between this car and the Ferrari. However, that Ferrari engine in the back of this thing, putting out about 800 to 830 horsepower. I've got 825 horsepower at 17,300 RPM quoted here. We can say a little bit higher or lower depending on what sort of mood we're in. Fuel, therefore, provided by Shell. Despite not having any Shell branding anywhere on this car, at least none that I've spotted yet, the car is running Shell fuels, and that, of course, is in association with Ferrari. Tires, though, unlike the Ferraris of this era, or basically any era of recent memory, this car's running on Michelin tires, so another key difference between the Ferrari and the Prost. The biggest key difference of all, though, relative to its Ferrari relative, is the competition history. Well, this car was driven by a lot of people, 5 different people as a matter of fact. Car number 22, driven by Jean Alesi, at least for some of the season, but not for the entirety of the season. Jean Alesi would later finish the 2001 season and therefore his career at Jordan, but I digress. Jean Alesi in car number 22. Later on in the season, Heinz-Harald Frentzen was driving car number 22. Frentzen had come over from Jordan for the end of the season, so Alesi and Frentzen basically swapped seats at the end of the year. Car number 23, though, was shared among 3 drivers. We had Gaston Mazzacane of Argentina, we had Luciano Burti of Brazil, and we had Tomáš Enga of the Czech Republic. So, yes, a number of seat swaps throughout this season. One of few circumstances that I can recall off the top of my head anyway, where the drivers who started the season, neither one finished the season with the team. So that's an interesting little stat there. The car made its race debut at the 2001 Australian Grand Prix, which was the first round of 2001. In total, it entered 17 races, and it took a grand total of 0 wins, 0 fastest laps, and 0 pole positions, therefore 0 constructors or drivers' championships. The overall results of the year, the car's highest finish was 5th, as we mentioned earlier, in Canada, courtesy of Jean Alesi. Jean Alesi, of course, a bit of a celebrity in Canada because it was the scene in 1995 of his only Formula One victory. However, Alesi also finished 6th in Monaco and 6th in Germany, so not too bad. And of course, those were point scoring positions, and those were the car's only points finishes of the year. So Jean Alesi, who didn't even finish out the season with the team, was responsible for 100% of Prost's points for 2001. Pretty interesting. Other drivers obviously didn't score any points. Frentzen, his best finish was 9th. Mazzacane's best finish was 12th. Burti's best finish was 8th. He did that also at the Canadian Grand Prix, so not a bad day in Canada for Prost. And Enga, his best result of only 2 starts was 12th at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. So, yes, not the best competition history, even though they had 5 different guys try their hand at driving this car. However, you would expect that from a midfield or backmarker team, however you want to characterize these guys. However, there's more to see on this car, and we shall take a little bit of a closer look at that presently. Stopping our rotation here for a general overview of our configuration. What do we have going on? Well, really, we have everything utterly conventional as you would expect it for this era. From front to rear, there is nothing that appears out of place or overtly innovative about this car, and I've got news for you. That's going to be the story of the entirety of this extravaganza, because this is a midfield backmarker car, really. We're not expecting true innovation here. We're just expecting survival for the most part, and unfortunately at the end of the year that wasn't enough even to survive for Prost Grand Prix. But what we've got here is a cogent and competent design for a Formula One car of the early 2000s. We have got our front and rear wings where you'd expect them to be. We've got some barge board activity going on through here. We have got some sculpting of the side pod into our free space to play with for feeding the top side of our diffuser. So we've got things going on in a way that's logical and makes sense. Taking a closer look here at the front end of the car, what do we see? Well, we see our front wing where we would expect it. We just have a straight across initial leading edge of our main plane surface. We don't have any interesting angles or anything like that, unlike what we had on, say, the McLaren MP416. However, we do have a flap that is displays longitudinally toward the rear a bit. Can't really see it from this angle, but we do have our flap for our primary downforce generation, as you would expect. We also have a reasonably sculpted end fence here with a bit of a channel here that is designed to create an inwashing vortex inside the front suspension, as you can see. And the steering is a little bit light on this one. It obviously works. Anyway, we have got our end fence sculpted there, sending a vortex through the front end to interface with the barge board, which starts about here. Can't quite see it from this angle because it's behind this big tire, but we have barge boards in this area as well, which are also quite reminiscent of the MP416 in terms of their overall shape and height, which is interesting to note. But very much like Ferrari on the F2001, we've got a low sloping nose coming down to a blunt point with short pylons attaching this wing. So an interesting expression of taking ideas from different areas on the grid. We've got some McLaren resemblances in terms of the barge board treatment, which we can't quite see yet, and we've got some strong Ferrari resemblances compared to, say, the F2001 with how they had their nose geometry relative to their attach points on the front wing. Again, for 2001, we're trying to lower our nose height a little bit, and the teams decided to do this in various ways. Prost deciding just to create a more tapered angle leading to the nose tip and then attaching the wing using short pylons. Viable solution. Many teams did something like this, and, well, it generally worked pretty well. Moving rearward, we see pretty quiet top side so far. We have got our pitot array and our antenna up here for sending our information to and from the pits, as you would expect. And then toward the center section, we have got ourselves our cockpit area. We got wing mirrors on each side in a conventional place. And then, of course, we have got our midsection with our driver's head, our snorkel for our air intake, and then that follows into our engine cover triangular heading down toward the rear zone. We've also got these rather large side pods housing our radiators and our other electronics equipment, as you would expect. Very similar in overall size and shape to the Ferrari side pods of this era, as you might expect, considering that this car has all Ferrari running gear underneath that engine cover. Additionally, you can see trailing edge of the barge board, very different in proportion and overall shape to the Ferraris of this era, so that's a unique trait. But then heading back toward our rear zone, again, you can see some very strong Ferrari resemblance. If we painted this thing red and white, you would say, hey, that looks an awful lot like a Ferrari, because, well, it generally does. The packaging through here, heading back toward the top side of our diffuser, you can see very nicely sculpted lines here. Of course, this would all be Prost manufacture, but again, we do have some constraints in terms of our specifications that are given to us by Ferrari to house the engine, so interesting stuff there. However, everything else, as you would see in an archetypical drawing of a generic type Formula One car of this era, it's here, and, well, it's all well and good. Again, it's competent, it's cogent, there's nothing that's particularly interesting about what we're seeing so far, but it works. Taking a look at the front end here on AP04, and what do we see? Well, again, just our straight across front wing. We're not playing with the angles or particularly the geometries of that main plane or the upper flap. Just straight across, simple as you like front wing. Pretty much literally interpreting the technical regulations for this era, because I'm sure in the FIA concept drawings they would have drawn a front wing that looked an awful lot like what you see right in front of you. However, that upper flap, we do have some sculpting in terms of the trailing edge. We have a gurney on it, and obviously this would be an adjustable section of wing. So, you know, they are using their limited resources to play a little bit. The designers can be a little bit creative and a little bit innovative, so they are where they can afford to be. So, again, good effort on that. However, we're not really setting the world alight in terms of something really interesting. Moving rearward a little bit, there we go, our front suspension in this area here, as you can see, a double wishbone push rod, utterly conventional, no surprises whatsoever. We have also got our brake ducts in here, as you would expect. Rather small duct, really. Obviously, that would be something that could change depending on weather and or circuit conditions. Obviously, your big braking circuits, like a place like Canada or Monza, for example, where you have a lot of stopping from high speed, you're going to want some bigger brake ducts because you're going to start to accrue temperature in those brakes. Other circuits, such as Monaco, for example, where you're not necessarily braking hard, but you're braking very often, you might want to run a large duct. because you can run into issues with brake cooling that way because you're just not getting the high speeds, and eventually you get cumulative temperature buildup, or you may decide that you want to clamp it down. It's not worth the extra drag. So brake ducts are something that you can change quite freely. Otherwise, though, we can see our nose geometry, that very simple taper to a point right there. Very cool. And then moving the rear still more, you can see our wing mirrors right here, our sides of the side pods on either side, and then obviously our cockpit, our air snorkel, and all of that. However, do you notice something to the sides of that snorkel? This is something interesting on this car. You see these two little appendages on either side. What are we doing? Remember, when we took a look at the Ferrari F2001 and F2002, what did we see? We saw these little appendages on either side of the snorkel. We also saw something similar on the McLaren MP416. What is this? Well, if you're a fan of, again, we'll use a McLaren reference, if you're a fan of the McLaren MP420 and the Viking horns on that car, that's what we're doing here on the Prost AP04 all the way back in 2001. This was something obviously that was not new. The Ferrari F1 2000 also had appendages like these on either side of the airbox, so again, this is not a Prost innovation, but you can see the overall trend is starting to take hold in overall design up and down the grid. We've got our driver's helmet obviously there in the center. It's going to create some aerodynamic turbulence, which means we need to smooth it out to make sure that we use our rear wing as efficiently as possible. So that's what those two little winglets are serving to do. Do they take care of the problem entirely? No, they do not. Was Ferrari or McLaren's design more effective? Probably. But Prost also getting in on the action here, and good on them. Again, they had a little bit of extra design budget. They decided to put that in. Why not? Definitely like it when a team who perhaps doesn't have all the resources as the big guys still tries to integrate an idea from the big guys, even though it is something small and rather inconsequential like this. I like it. And it's something that we unfortunately don't see all that often anymore in Formula One, and I wish we would. But here it was, Prost, trying as they might to take a little bit of time out of the front of the grid there by using something that Ferrari and McLaren had been putting on their cars for the last couple of years. I like it. Good job, guys. Now, taking a look from the right side of AP04, here's where we can take our first real look at the entire car as a cohesive piece here. Is it quite cohesive? Yeah, it kind of is. I mean, again, this is a competent, logical design. It just was not the best in terms of performance-wise, but it's a good design nonetheless, and you can just see that in terms of the visual cohesion of everything. Every element on this car is flowing into the next in a way that's not jarring. It doesn't appear to be overtly angular or turbulent in terms of what the air is going to do. I like it. I really do. It's odd, but I like it. Anyway, in the front zone of the car, there is our front nose and wing assembly, and you can see what we're doing here with our end fence. We do have this considerable effort at sculpting that end fence, where we have got this flat plane toward the ground with a vortex generator underneath. We also have a vortex generator in the side of the end fence designed to create inwash through the front axle inboard of the tire and wheel assembly so that we go through the suspension elements relatively unencumbered. We also get to this absolutely enormous barge board. There's just one of them per side. We don't have multiple levels like we had on some other cars, even of this era, but particularly as we started to progress through the 2000s decade. By 04, 05, we started to have some pretty crazy designs here. But here, just one enormous panel here running from fore to aft. Very similar in size and shape to the barge boards on the McLaren MP416, also of the 2001 season. And I'd really have to wonder when Prost decided to go with this design. It's a fairly generic shape. It's something that they clearly could have come up with on their own, and I'd be surprised if they didn't come up with something rather like this on their own, if not this entirely. But McLaren also had a similar idea, so some visual commonality between cars at the front and the back of the grid. Obviously, also a lot of flat area for sponsors, unfortunately slightly underutilized in the sponsorship department, but we do have one for good measure. Our suspension elements here, our upper and lower wishbones, are coming through the barge board. That is something to take some note of, though. The The barge board is secured to the leading edge of the floor by this strut right here. That would be done in carbon to attach it to the leading edge of the floor here and our reference plane on this step plane era Formula One car. Top side, you can see just smooth, unencumbered lines all the way from the nose tip toward the cockpit. We've got this minuscule little windscreen right here, and then of course we start to get into our wing mirrors and then where our driver is seated. There is our Jean Alesi in the cockpit, very cool. Cockpit sides are pretty high relative to where the driver's head is, and that's always useful. Obviously, this is the crushable foam bolster that his head is designed to run into in the event of a high-speed lateral impact in particular, and Prost definitely utilizing the available real estate there to help secure their driver. So much appreciated. Obviously, this area of the car has always been under rather strict scrutiny because driver injury is something we're trying to avoid, and one of the best ways to do that is with passive safety devices like this. Something that's always there, but it's out of the way until you really need it, and there it is. So very nice. Also, I appreciate the decal work here, Alesi and the flag of France. We've got our emergency kill switch for the marshals and some sponsorship decal here, but very, very cool. I do enjoy that immensely. Also, the detail on Alesi's helmet, this chrome helmet that he had for the majority of his career anyway, that is nice. So very reflective. Very, very cool. Moving back a little bit. Top side of the side pod, we just have this flat plane presenting to the airflow with our duct coming in through here. Very cool. And then we just have some sculpting of the upper surface very gradually. Nothing that's particularly obtuse, but there it is. Just smooth, unencumbered flow coming down. What we also see here is a chimney. This is something, again, that we saw on Ferrari F2001 and F2002. But what we don't have here, which is something that distinguishes these designs, is we don't have a little auxiliary winglet just aft of this chimney. On the Ferrari, we would have had something here, a little winglet in about this area so that this exhaust flow from the chimney comes out and interfaces with it. We don't have that here on the Prost. We just have the chimney, and then that's it. So this air is just going to be shot out the back, and it's most likely going to just sort of move up and above the rear axle and our little winglet here. This little winglet here is something that we did see on pretty much all of the other cars, so the Prost has it for good measure, and it's just designed to take some of the air away from the vicinity of the rear tire so that we're not generating quite as much drag thereby. To the extreme rear of the car, what do we have? We have got our rear wing. Again, very simplistic end fences in this era. Par for the course, nobody was trying anything with sculpting the lateral profiles of these end fences. That really wouldn't come until about 2005 when they moved these rear wings forward a little bit. Here, just very simple up and down. It's designed to keep the elements of the wing together, and that's exactly what it does. Rear wheel and tire, there's the Michelin tire and our BBS wheel. Very cool. I also like the wheel nut detail on the car there. Very, very cool. And just barely, there is a brake caliper mounted right about here if you're looking hard. Like that. Like that an awful lot. Also on this car, just speaking as the model that it is, the paintwork is very, very nice. And we'll take a closer look at this later on. But this deep blue color, I like it. The camera might be making it look a little bit lighter in terms of color value than it actually is. But I like it. It's got nice depth to it. The finish is nice. And there's even a light speckle finish to it. So again, very nice. It has very nice reflective properties as well. So all in all, just very nicely wrapped up visually as far as the AP04 is going. I definitely do enjoy it, as strange as it seems. Rear zone on AP04. What do we have here? Well, again, things that are utterly conventional. No surprises here, really, but some rather strong resemblances to the rear zone of, say, the Ferrari F2001 or the F1 2000, both of which are fairly interchangeable in their own right. But here, obviously, we are designed to run a Ferrari engine and Ferrari gearbox and Ferrari differential. We need to be thinking about packaging along similar lines as the Ferrari factory cars. So that's what Prost did here, quite obviously. You can see we've got our diffuser, fairly straightforward, triple level if you count the reference plane. So there's level 1, level 2 moving a little bit further inboard, and then level 3 is the central tunnel right there. So that makes perfect sense. No surprises there. What is a little bit more surprising or less surprising, depending on your perspective, is right here, our exhausts. We have the periscope style exhaust topside on this car. That is a Ferrari hallmark. If you remember on the McLaren MP416, they did not do this, and it's not something that was universal in this time. Ferrari, they were the progenitors, the innovators of the periscope exhaust back in 1998, and it's not something that the rest of the field, and it's not something that the rest of the engine manufacturers adopted right away. McLaren used their blown diffuser design, a few other teams, even Minardi used a blown diffuser in this era, so this was still somewhat of an innovative approach to managing your exhausts, and obviously the Ferrari engine liked it. The Ferrari engine was optimized to run with this style exhaust, so even when you repackaged that engine and you put it into a different car, it still required those periscope exhausts, so it was something that was utterly integral to Ferrari's design philosophy in this era, quite evidently, and therefore Prost, they just had to adapt to it and provide space to vent the exhausts up there. So we've got our Ferrari style periscope exhaust here on the Prost, which really makes sense in hindsight, but it's here. Additionally, we just have our rear wing right here, our main plane mounted nicely, and then a beam wing in this area as well. Our periscope style exhausts, therefore, they do allow the air to be blown straight back and blow the beam wing as you would expect, also blowing the top surfaces of the rear suspension, which are just behind the beam wing from our vantage point here, but they do have aerodynamic fairings on them designed to interface with that exhaust just a little bit, and therefore create maybe a few points of extra downforce. Also around the exhaust, you can see we've got this silver treated area. This is obviously high heat, so we are treating this area of the bodywork to deal with that high heat. We also have some more heat shielding just abeam and aft of those exhaust outlets. Can't quite see it, but it's just an unfinished section with a little bit of heat treatment there. It's a bare carbon color rather than blue like the rest of the bodywork. But nicely put together, all things considered. Obviously, you can see how the car is definitely having to account for the Ferrari engine back here in terms of the packaging and other elements of the configuration, but also it is unique. So I do very much appreciate what they're doing. Again, despite things not being particularly interesting in terms of an innovation standpoint, it's competent and it's cogent and it makes sense and it looks nice as well. So I definitely can appreciate this. From the left side of AP04, again, the car is utterly symmetrical from left to right, so no surprises here on the left that we did not see on the right. However, just to take a look at what we've got going on. Fairly cohesive. And again, very, very logical all the way from fore to aft. So there is nothing here that doesn't make sense. There is nothing here that screams ambitious but rubbish. It's just what it is. It's a well thought out car, despite it being toward the back of the grid. It's really, really cool to see that. It doesn't necessarily mean in Formula One that cars that look good are going to be fast and cars that don't look good are going to be slow. This car, in my opinion, looks good. And it just wasn't fast, even though it had the Constructors' Championship winning engine in the back. Just again, it's more than just having the best engine, it's more than just having the best aerodynamics, it's more than just having the best drivers. It's an entire team from the word go on the first draft of a design all the way to the last round of the season. Everything has to be working together just right, and if you don't have all of your pieces in a row, say, for example, in more recent times in Ferrari in 2022, things don't work out for you. So you can build a great car and not win the championship, or you can build a not so great car and maybe overcome some difficulties and come out on top. Same thing at the back of the grid. You can build a good looking car, but you're not going to grab headlines if you don't have the team behind it. And obviously Prost, being in the financial situations that they were in this era, having to swap the seat 5 times between drivers, that's not good for putting together a championship charge. Even if you're not trying to fight for the World Championship P1, you're trying to fight for the World Championship best of the rest, or best of the midfield, or best of the backmarkers, and you need everything working in this synergistic, simpatico sort of way, and it just wasn't working here for Prost, but they built a nice looking race car despite all of that. Going freehand here on AP04, take a closer look at some of the things that perhaps we did not see earlier on from farther out. There is our front wing. Again, utterly stereotypical of an early 2000s era Formula One car. The FIA concept drawing, as I strongly suspect, yes, it probably looks almost exactly like this. We're not being very imaginative here because we can't afford it. Again, it's generally speaking, the less, I don't want to say the less sophisticated or more simplistic, but the more, basically the more straight lines you see on a Formula One design, it's more indicative of a lower budget team. We'll say that. I don't want to say that these guys were unimaginative. I just want to say that they're restricted in terms of resources, because that was the truth. I mean, Luc Bichois is currently heading up Ferrari right now in terms of their aerodynamic department. So again, we had competent people working on this car, but they were limited by the resources at hand. And this front wing is just one of those indications of, yeah, money trouble here at Prost. But regardless, there is the front wing straight across in the main plane surface, as you would expect. Nothing untoward there. And then that upper flap where we're generating the majority of our downforce. Little slot gap between the main plane and the front wing there. Not quite evident here on the model, but there would have been one in reality. And then obviously we have got those pylons on the nose that's linking it up to the front wing. We're trying to allow some air to spill through there. First of all, to go to the flap that's underneath the nose, so we can see, but also to start to feed the under tray right here. So really nice. Double wishbone pushrod front suspension. There we go. See, plenty of detail on that. Nicely wrapped in carbon. Clean as you like. Very, very nice. And then, of course, our top side with our pitot array and antenna. Some hatches there for accessing the pushrod mounting points, as well as where our torsion bar would go in there for our damper setup. And then further aft, just underneath the antenna, we've got another hatch for accessing the footwell and pedal box on this car. Very, very cool. Additionally, we start to get in here with our barge boards. Just single element barge boards, but they are sculpted in their bottom face there. We have got our suspension members going through the barge boards in places. That's our upper and lower wishbone, the trailing element there, going through the barge board on each side. So that's cool. And of course, good thinking in that regard. The barge board itself, as we come up a little bit, there we go. You can see more or less its general disposition from here. Very nice in all of that. Top side, there's our geometry of our side pod linking up to the side of the monocoque. Our duct in there. Very cool. There's no attempt at a radiator matrix inside, but there is an open duct, which you can see quite readily, which is very much appreciated. And then our cockpit area. Wing mirrors, nothing really unconventional here. They're just mirrors. And then we have our Jean Alesi installed in there. Very nice. We do have an attempt at the pull tabs here for removing the cockpit surround. And we have also got his hands and steering wheel. The hands are pretty nicely modeled on this one. He does have 5 fingers on each hand, so that is very cool. I like that. That is a detail that we overlook sometimes on these models where we do have drivers fitted, but here it's there and it looks really, really nice, as does his suit. We have got ourselves, obviously, the helmet, very highly reflective, which I appreciate, with his personal and then the Prost team sponsors. And then, of course, the seat belts. They are injection molded as part of the driver here, but they are there and they look appropriate, so I can't really fault anything with this. It looks really, really cool. The steering wheel itself, I don't have any ability to see too well on it from my personal angle here, but it doesn't seem that we have any paddles on it, nor do we have any modeling of the quick release collar there attaching it to the steering column, but the steering wheel in terms of its shape and size looks good. Jean Alesi also, he had a very distinctive hand position. Rather than using the stereotypical 3 and 9 hand position that most racing drivers use, regardless of what discipline they're in, Jean Alesi preferred the 10 and 2. As for why he did, I'm not sure. Probably a little bit of an advantage in leverage. You can get a little bit better leverage when you're turning the wheel from center, but as you start to turn further through the lock, it starts to become a little bit of a disadvantage. However, at Formula One steering rack, where the wheel's not really designed to go past one full turn at the absolute extreme, and that's going through the hairpin at Monaco, well, not really. It's not a problem at all. Especially in this era, because by this time we had power steering, so that 10 and 2 position. It always worked for Jean Alesi. It enabled him to always be driving the car at 10 tenths, which is really cool because Jean Alesi giving it 10 tenths means he's sliding through every corner. He looks like he's doing 1,000,000 miles an hour on his way to 10th place. So that is Jean Alesi. I've got to love the guy. You cannot fault his commitment at all. Anyway, though, outboard on the car, there's that nice blue color coming back into focus. I really like that immensely. There is our side pod. You can see where the barge board links up with the reference plane, and then the reference plane itself, and then underneath our winglet feeding the top side of the diffuser. There's our chimney, and then our exhaust outlets start to come in here. We can see now from this view what we were discussing in terms of the heat treatment on the bodywork. You can see now we have got our exhaust outlets there, the periscope style, and then we have got the silver around the outlets themselves, as well as that heat-treated black bodywork there. So you can see what they're doing, and it's very reminiscent of course, the rear ends on the Ferraris of this era because, well, it's basically Ferrari running gear all underneath there. So really nice. Also, a little bit of heat treatment attempt on the rear wing, maybe a little bit. Not tremendous difference there, but you can see a color difference between the support pylon and rear crash structure versus the rest of the beam wing. So that's what we'll call it. Nice carbon finish there on the main plane of the rear wing, and then our upper flap in body color blue. So that is really nicely put together, all things considered. So again, I am really fond of this little car for whatever reason. It just looks the part. Again, it did not win any awards for performance, but it should win some awards for aesthetics because it is very, very pretty. Now, looking into the cockpit from the right rear, and what do we see here? Well, there's our steering wheel detail with a little bit of an LCD display on there. Wouldn't be anything spectacular in this era, but it would be there, and they've bothered to model that to some extent. I appreciate that. We also have a barge, not a barge board, but a dashboard behind that steering wheel. You can see some of that in there. Again, nothing spectacular, but it's more dashboard detail than we get on a lot of other Mini Champs models, so I appreciate that. And then finally, the rest of the steering wheel itself with some button and switch detail there. It's just areas of different colored paint, but it looks the part, and the overall size and shape is very much appropriate compared to what we saw in the onboards of this era, so that is very much appreciated. Also very much appreciated is Jean Alesi's helmet. Again, you can see how reflective it is. Very nice. The graphics on it are very crisp and clear. The Ray-Ban sunglasses mark there, very, very nice and obviously recognizable. And then moving outboard a little bit, the wing mirrors with the reflective surface in there. That's all very nice. And then the cockpit surround, the lifting point there, that's the hole behind the emergency kill switch. And then, of course, our snorkel and engine cover. Very nice. I love the paint on this thing. You can just see some speckling in that paint finish. Looks very, very good. No complaints from me at all. Very good indeed. There are our exhausts. There's actually just the slightest bit of orange inside the exhaust outlets there. Had to be intentional on the part of Mini Champs, but it just adds a little bit more depth, and it gives a little bit of an illusion that the car is absolutely hot and ready to go. So that's cool. I like that. Then of course our rear wing, rear crash structure, and rain light. Very cool. You can also see pieces of that beam wing, the mounting hardware for the beam wing, through the end fences on this rear wing, so that looks good. Greatly appreciate that detail. Then our rear tire and diffuser. Very nice. Very, very nice. For a car that didn't win any awards in terms of its on-track performance, it wins plenty of awards here for looks. It's just well sorted, and it's just a nicely done little car. Again, I have no complaints about it whatsoever. I just wish that perhaps it were a little bit more noteworthy in terms of its career. And you know, it's also one of Jean Alesi's last Formula One cars. I mean, Jean Alesi, again, a cult favorite. Who doesn't love Jean Alesi? And this was one of the cars that he finished his career with. He ultimately finished his career in the Jordan, but for the beginning of the year anyway, he drove this. And, well, he looked pretty good in it, I must say. I like it. I like it an awful lot. And finally, a look at the under tray here on AP04. What do we have? Well, utterly conventional. We have got a single keel front end. So again, the keel on a Formula One car, basically where we were mounting our lower wishbones in this era. Obviously, you can see what they're doing here. That protrusion underneath the monocoque, that is the keel, and we just have one of them here, unlike some other cars where we had a split hybrid keel design where we're integrating the keel with barge boards on some of these cars. Think cars like the McLaren MP418, McLaren MP420 using a split or twin or hybrid keel design. This, a single keel, and obviously we would see a similar design on the Ferraris of this era as well, even though the front suspension was entirely of Prost's design. There is our front wing. You can see the distinction between the main plane and the upper flap, and our end fences there with our vortex generators there on the end fences. Cool. Barge boards, you can see how big they are, really. Again, very reminiscent of the McLaren MP416, but there they are. And you can see the struts that are helping to secure them, both to the reference plane as well as to the side of the monocoque. And then here is our T-tray, legality plank, step plane area. What can we see on the model? 118, made in China. Then, of course, Paul's model art moving outboard on the reference plane. Mini champs. And then Prost Acer AP04 2001. Acer, of course, they were the title sponsor of the team, but they were also credited as being the engine builder, even though it was obviously Ferrari. We had some interesting agreements in this era in terms of engine supplies. I don't know why Ferrari didn't want to directly put their name on engines in this era, so these engines were labeled as Acer. I remember Arrows in this era, they ran engines that were badged as Asia Tech, but I believe they were actually Peugeot engines. Ferrari also labeling their engines as Petronas in the Saubers, even though they were also, in this case, the Ferrari 049. So, again, some interesting nomenclature in this era, but Prost Acer just means it's Prost Ferrari for the most part. Otherwise, though, utterly conventional underneath here. Expansion zone for the diffuser, central tunnel, and then our rear wing, the beam wing of which we can see there, and then our rear suspension. So that's the underside of a backmarker car, really. But very clean and very cohesive, even from underneath.
So there it was, the Prost AP04. Ultimately, this car signaled the end of the Formula One career of Alain Prost. His career as a driver ended in 1993, but his career as a team owner and his true presence on the grid finally ended at the end of 2001. And what a remarkable career it was, with 4 world championships. Not too many people have done that, and Alain Prost is one of them. However, a lot of the characteristics of this car, running that Ferrari engine and driveline, ultimately that was a big trigger as to what caused the team to go into consolidation and liquidation at the end of the year, and ultimately it ended their presence on the grid. According to some sources of the period, Ferrari were demanding up to $30 million up front for Prost and their privilege of running the Ferrari engine and driveline for the balance of 2001. $30 million could be a big chunk, maybe even close to 100% of the development budget of a team like this in this era. So that was an absolutely enormous bill to pay before they even turned a wheel in anger. And really, when you're a minnow team to begin with, when you're having a lot of trouble even getting into the top 10, never mind scoring points consistently, never mind attracting sponsors, you can see the blue paint that I'm so fond of on this car. What does that really highlight? It highlights the general lack of big sponsorship space being sold on this car. All of that affects the bottom line, and at the end of the day, putting your own name on the side pods, as Prost did here, okay, it looks good. Maybe it makes you feel good in terms of stroking your ego, but it's not making you any money to advertise for yourself. Unfortunately, that is what happened to Prost Grand Prix by the end of 2001. That Ferrari deal helping them quite significantly, obviously, to get the car off of the drawing board and onto the racetrack to begin with, but having to pay $30 million at least up front, well, That put a big chunk out of the bottom line, and ultimately it was something that was not recoverable for Prost Grand Prix, and this was the last time that we would see them on the grid. However, what a great story that is for a four-time world champion, as if that's not enough of an impressive resume, for him then to come back a few years after his driving career and then run a team. That is really, really cool. And it's the team that used to be Ligier, which very famously won the 1996 Monaco Grand Prix. So that's cool. You have a bit of an interesting story in your history and your pedigree. So why not see if you can add to it? I greatly admire that on the part of Alain Prost, and good on him for trying. However, this model here in 1/18 scale, it is absolutely great work by Mini Champs. Everything about it is fantastic, from that wonderful finish on the blue paint to the build quality to the overall size and fit and finish and proportion of everything. It is all together as you would expect. I have no complaints about this one. And again, it's a little bit of an oddball, off the wall car, not something particularly mainstream, not something that's going to be particularly sought after, I would think, but it's here and I have it and I like it and I'm glad that it is part of my collection. Until next time, though, I do thank you all very much for watching. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you, and of course, we will see you soon.